Welcome, everybody. I'm Jason Nazar, the co-founder and CEO of Comparably, and I'm unbelievably excited to have Sarah Friar, the CEO of Nextdoor, with us today. How are you, Sarah?
I'm great. Thanks, Jason. I'm really excited too. Sounds like you're an active Nextdoor user, so we can get going talking about that.
Yeah, there are. We've done this series for a long time now. We've had some amazing guests. I will tell you, I am in awe of what Nextdoor has accomplished. My wife and I are on the app all day long. It's been so valuable for us and in our community, and so we've been really looking forward to this conversation. For those of you joining us for the first time, thank you. For those of us that have come back and have been watching multiple episodes here on Entrepreneur, we thank you for your continued participation in the series. This is an If I Knew Then interview series with amazing CEOs like Sarah, where we're looking back at the most important leadership lessons that folks have learned over their career. I'm a serial entrepreneur. I've been running companies for the past 20 years, mostly in the tech space. I sold my last company, Intuit. I started Comparably to be an employee review platform that provided the most fair and accurate data on what kind of experience women and people of color and all sorts of different employees were having at companies. I'm an active angel investor and board member here in Southern California. And it is rare that, I'm just completely in awe of what somebody has accomplished in their career. And I think one of the things that everyone's going to find out today is this unbelievable background that you have, Sarah. So I'm excited to get into that. But I think everyone here is going to know what Nextdoor is. But in your own words, would love to have you share with everybody how you describe Nextdoor today.
Sure. Well, thank you for that. I hope I can live up to some of the expectation. So Nextdoor is the neighborhood hub. Think of it as the place you go to find out what's going on locally. It could be something like, what's the best place to have a coffee? Where do the locals around here hike? Sometimes it's because you're cleaning out your garage or your wardrobe or whatever, which a lot of people have done during COVID as they've sheltered in place. And so you're getting rid of that thing that doesn't give you love anymore. So our for sale and free platform is very vibrant. Sometimes it's to find a local resource, a local business, like a plumber when you're just desperately in need. So as we often say, people come for the utility, but they stay for the community. And we know that when communities get together, when communities are stronger, it's how they survive and thrive, even in moments of intense crisis, like we've all been living through, but just even in the normal day-to-day. So Nextdoor is the place to come to if you care at all about your neighborhood.
To me, I think what's so special about Nextdoor, and obviously there's been a lot of talk about social media recently and, things that platforms like Facebook or Instagram, or Twitter need to be doing better. I think what's so unique about Nextdoor is you're not trying to build this image and get likes and use it to be seen. It's really about connecting to people that are close to you. And one of the things that I was so taken aback with is how important Nextdoor was during COVID, where neighbors were helping neighbors, get through some of the toughest times, financially and health-wise. What do you see as kind of just the core DNA that makes Nextdoor different than other social networking platforms?
Yeah, so we often start by talking about how we're founded in trust. So you actually have to verify that you're a real neighbor living at that real address. So there's no bots, there's no trolls. It's very authentic because you're there with your name and often the street or at least the neighborhood that you live in. So we think that's just a good starting point because people are more accountable and frankly on better behavior. We see this huge shift to local at the moment. So 66% of the neighbors that are on our platform now say that they view their neighbor as their first line of defense. And so if you look at what happened during COVID, hindsight is 2020 and it feels very structured and organized now when I look back. But one of the very first things that we really ran towards was to make sure that the right information was getting out into neighborhoods at a moment in time when people felt very awash and lots of news stories coming at them, lots of potentially misleading information. How do we make sure they get the right information? We work with a huge number of public agencies to make sure that great information is right there and upfront in your feed. From, I think, the governor here in California, Governor Newsom, Governor Cuomo in New York. If you think about the UK, the National Health Service, the UK government, the French Foreign Ministry, I should have said right at the very top, we're in 11 countries, 268,000 neighborhoods. So we actually saw this wave of the current crisis starting in Italy before it really ended up crossing the Atlantic and doing what it's doing right now in the US. In fact, Australia was the country where it got to last. But first up was that information point. Second was something you said to me as we were getting ready to chat today, which was help. We saw immediately that people wanted to give help. So it's a very human condition that when you're faced with a crisis, you want some personal agency. Like, this big thing, I don't know what to do, but what can I do in a small way that could make a difference? So there was a lot of hands being extended to say, what can I do? And of course, like, we may not remember what was going on in March and April, but there was a lot of searching for toilet paper going on. And it turns out that could be a crisis in and of itself. But there were a lot of elderly people, a lot of vulnerable people who have illnesses, who really, really had to think about their health, who were actually saying, okay, I need help. And so we created two products, a help map where you could plot on the map that you were willing to give help, but we didn't want to create a map of the vulnerable because that would be a bad product decision. So then we created help groups where people could actually connect more one-to-one. I personally have connected with two neighbors who are both in slightly different situations. One is more around health, that she can't leave her home and her husband is in the same place. And then the second is a little bit older, and frankly, her children live in the UK. So in a weird twist for me, it's been a nice way to think about how to give back, because I have older parents living in the UK where their neighbors are helping them. A couple of other things I'll mention, and then we can dig into if it's interesting. We definitely saw a rise in people wanting to support local businesses. So about 88% of neighbors say, I want to shop local. They know that if that local business goes out of business, it really changes the look and feel of their neighborhood. Nonprofits are hurting. So we launched a product in July called Sell for Good, where if I do have that bike that my son has grown out of in the garage, instead of just selling it on Nextdoor or maybe giving it away for free, I can now actually sell it and donate immediately to a local organization. And nonprofits are really hurting because they don't carry a lot of incremental cash on their balance sheet to survive. And then finally, in the last few months, really as this, I would call it the third crisis, once you got through the financial crisis, the third crisis around social unrest, we've really tried to do a lot, to your point, to make sure that Nextdoor is a place where, first of all, there is no place for racism. But second, how do we really norm people to say, here's how you should behave? So we launched things like our Good Neighbor Pledge, where it reminds you when you're on Nextdoor, be helpful, not harmful, be respectful, don't discriminate. And we've also done a full rebrand, which has been fun to do. It was a lot of work, but it's really about this action of neighboring being a verb, not a noun. So it's an actionable thing that you do, even if it's just a small action, like giving someone a wave when you're out for a walk with your dog.
Yeah, I think one of the things that stands out to be about Nextdoor is, I put it in two buckets. One, the founding team and everyone that came after just did such an incredible job of product market fit. I mean, think of the hundreds or thousands of social networks that were created after Facebook and LinkedIn and Instagram. And they didn't speak to somebody's true needs, right? And just the fact that Nextdoor even broke out of that pack and as big as you are today. I think the second thing that stands out to me is, the internet and so social media sites become a reflection of our better angels and of our worst demons. Mm-hmm. And I think what is really special about Nextdoor is many of us don't know our neighbors like our parents or grandparents did 30 or 60 years ago. And I think one of the things that you see is it doesn't just connect you to your immediate community. You really see how much people want to help each other. And I think for me, one of the things that really shines in Nextdoor is how positive it is versus a lot of other things that you interact with online and the internet.
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple of things in there, given that, part of our group out here right now are entrepreneurs. I think the product market fit thing that you mentioned is huge. I mean, of course, it's obvious when you're building a company, find product market fit. But I think our founders really spent a lot of time thinking about what could be different and unique here. And so they created a whole different graph, right? Not a friend graph, not a professional graph, but literally a graph built around proximity. and a recognition, to your point, that socially or societally, we've kind of let those relationships fall away. The second thing in, the tech for good sort of meme, like I actually really believe you can create societal change while building a big, important business. And it comes back to that insight around strong, weak ties. It's a little wonky and academic, but if you've ever read any of Mark Granovetter's work, this concept that when you have stronger, weak ties, like when the local coffee shop owner knows your name and says it when you come in the door, or gives you, here's the, do you want your usual, right? Those moments have actually, for ourselves, if we're being selfish, incredible impacts on our health, actually, on our actual, not just our psychology, but our physiology, because of the hormones that are released when something good like that happens. And I think the second thing is when those ties are stronger out in the community, the point I've made before is that communities actually survive. So when you look at communities that are impacted, Hurricane Harvey in Houston was kind of an early read for Nextdoor that we could do more than just be utility, because the communities that were heavy Nextdoor users before that crisis, then they used it during, because literally someone would be on their Nextdoor app saying, I'm on the roof of my house. And there were no numbers available. The emergency services were overwhelmed. Like you couldn't see the number of the house because it was underwater. It was the neighbor in a boat that was coming to get you off that roof in that moment. But actually the most interesting piece is the after, where we see that communities stay and recover versus kind of giving up on it. Like one thing about US society is people can be more nomadic, right? They tend to move around the country more than you would see, for example, like where I grew up. And so unless you build those strong, weak ties in, communities kind of dissipate. So there's a lot there on how our original founders found that insight and really thought hard about not creating thought bubbles as well, which, whether it's better lucky than good, I don't know which, but I would go with good. They figured out without those thought bubbles, right, you have much more diversity of conversation, which I hope actually can have societal change too.
Yeah. All right, we're going to come back to Nextdoor in a bit. So many more questions there. I think you have one of the most fascinating backgrounds of anyone I've ever met. And I'm going to share some of it because I have a feeling you're too humble to tell folks all the amazing things. But, went to Oxford and Stanford. I think you studied engineering and got an MBA, went on to Goldman and McKinsey, transitioned to amazing organizations like Salesforce and Square, where you were the CFO, now running the company Nextdoor. And so, and the backdrop of all this is you grew up in a pretty small town in Ireland. Yeah. So, I'm really fascinated by people's early life motivation. When you were growing up, were you part of a big family? Did you feel like you wanted to have this big life? Like, how did you get from that corner of the world to basically connecting all of the world today?
Oh, that's such a nice arc. I hope I live up to it. To set the scene, so I grew up in Northern Ireland on a border town in the 70s and 80s. I'm not totally giving away my age. During what we all euphemistically call the Troubles. So take a read if you don't know, but effectively it was a community at war because of a religious divide. And it was not a good time. It was a beautiful community to grow up in, but there were really bad things happening. So actually was a village, so under, I think, a 3,000 population. Like the local police barracks probably got blown up 3 or 4 times during my childhood. I can't remember. And when that would happen, what you have to realize is a bomb kind of goes out and breaks all of the windows. And the idea was more to create property damage than per se killing people, although that happened too. And so you lived with that as this backdrop where you were always a little on edge. Like I have a memory of being in Oxford very early, probably my first or second year, and literally walking down the street with a friend and a car backfired and I just hit the ground. Like my friend was a little bit like, where'd she go? Because I just thought a shot had been fired because I grew up where that actually happened to me in my local town and we all knew to hit the ground. And I'm still very suspicious of any bags or packages left anywhere. I'm always convinced that something bad could happen there. So that was the backdrop. What caused me to think differently, I don't know if I have like the silver bullet on that one, I definitely won the lottery of life in terms of being smart enough to go to a great college like Oxford. And that's a privilege and a total lottery move, I believe. But I was definitely taught the power of hard work by my parents, definitely taught to really value community. So that's why this is a very nice arc to come back to next door. My mom was like the local nurse. My dad was the local HR manager in our local mill. So this power of community and always helping others and paying it forward. But I think I was also super curious. And, if there was a trait that I'm glad I have, it's that curiosity. And so I knew I could not stay in Northern Ireland. It felt way too small. I just wanted to see the world. So at 18, pre-college, I actually took a year out and I worked for a while to make some money. And then I backpacked through, how many people know this, but I backpacked through Asia at 18, 19. I'm not sure I'd let my daughter go do that now. At a time when, there was you weren't like communicating, through whatever app to your parents. I would call home every 2 weeks. But that curiosity really just, fired up such a need to keep it going, keep going, finding new things, find new ways to take risks, but, hopefully educated risks.
Yeah, I'm curious to get your take on the nature nurture debate. I think for most of my life, I had been more on the nurture and always wanted to believe that somebody could map their destiny, and I really still do. I think being the parent of now two small boys, I see firsthand people come into this world hardwired a certain way, you
Mm-hmm.
know? And I think it's our job as parents, our job as managers, our job as leaders to always try to help people become their absolute best potential and find their true north. I'm curious how you think about that, in the context of growing the company. Obviously, you've lived this incredible life journey that most people couldn't imagine. And how much of that, from your opinion, were the lessons your parents taught you early on and the mentors you had along the way? And how much of that you felt came from this something that was inside of you, whether it was that insatiable curiosity or a dream for something big that was just with you from the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, your point on when you see it in your kids, or just when you see them be so different, it really starts to bring it home how much maybe it is just innate. It's not the nurturing. I think that it has to be there to start with, and then I think where nurturing kicks in is it can amplify, the good and frankly the bad as well. Something I think a lot about on a social media platform. But I think there's a lot of innate there too, because, my best friends, how at the time you think of are most like you. And by the way, they're still some of my best friends in the world, right? They just didn't have that same, interest or willingness, or were too, afraid of maybe taking some of those risks. Like even going to university in England was a big far step out of the norm, because Northern Irish people typically stay home in Northern Ireland or they go to Scotland. Very, very, very few go to England. And no, I mean, I really don't know if I knew anyone that had ever gone to like Oxford or Cambridge. So I think that means it has to be somewhat innate, because if anything, my parents were probably pushing a little against me on some of those decisions early on, because they had their own kind of fears. Right? Neither of my parents went to college. They were worried about money and how would you pay for it. They were worried about me, I'm sure. Like, would I be safe, or, would I fit in? And so there's a lot of innate, and that's why it's so interesting when you get a chance to go mentor others, like finding the what's innate, but then how do you push on them and really get them to amplify those amazing skills that they're bringing to the table. And that's true if you're mentoring people or just as you build an organization. Really kind of understanding what's driving someone, like both what they're passionate about, but also what they're really good at.
Yeah, I think one of the lessons I learned early on in my career and that I try to pass on is that often people are most successful professionally, not because they get really good at improving their weaknesses, but because they take the thing that they do extraordinarily well and they do that better than anyone. And one of the questions I'll ask every candidate in an interview process, I say, what is your work superpower? What do you
Yeah.
do better than anything else? One of the things I just want to stay on for just one more minute is, to me, there's three parts of your background that are so fascinating. right? And I'm a tech entrepreneur. I grew up in LA. I spent my whole life in LA. I know so many folks that, either grew up in New York, grew up in San Francisco. They went and became entrepreneurs early on. To me, I think there's three distinguishing things about your background. The first is that, you've transitioned into being a company leader from a finance background, which really gives a very unique perspective, right? And the things that you accomplished at Square and Salesforce are challenges that a lot of CEOs never have to directly deal with themselves. I think the other thing that really stands out is this, like the amount of culture you had early on and how you grew up in Ireland. I didn't know that you backpacked around Asia for a year. You had lived in, I think, South Africa for a while. I'm just curious, like, how do those experiences of like of your formative years of where you grew up and living in all these different places around the world. I mean, they couldn't have handpicked a more perfect CEO for Nextdoor. But like, what were the lessons that you learned growing up in Ireland, backpacking those years in Asia, living all around the world that you use to as a CEO today and to grow the company today?
Yeah, so definitely one is this, don't be afraid to take risks. Like I often say, if you don't get an adrenaline rush every day, you're probably not being stretched enough. Like maybe time to find the next job, the next role, whatever. So I am big on the adrenaline rush. I think the second thing is that analytical side of me. So I will jokingly say to my team, I've never met a number I didn't like. And I just think that people are just not good still with numbers. It's not that they're not facile with numbers, it's they just don't go the extra increment. Like a number without context shows up all the time. So an example would be, right now we're in the middle of planning. So we're going to get 10 new neighbors on the platform. I'm like, okay, is 10 good, bad, or what should I feel about it? Okay, what I would like to see is I'm going to add 10 new neighbors compared to adding 5 new neighbors last quarter and 1 new neighbor a year ago. Now I'm like, okay, 10 actually sounds like a pretty good number. But, and there's probably other triangulations, but numbers without context, I think are just dangerous. Like people use them as kind of shields to either say things are going great, look, I've got 10, or they use them as, they end up being like cotton wool around their really good idea because it keeps muting it because you can't get the true insight to come out. And then I think the third thing, which I probably should have put first, is people first. So if you talk to anyone that works with me, they'll know like my management philosophy starts with people first, where I fundamentally believe if you get your people right, everything else just kind of works from there. Like tough problems, they'll figure it out. Great people hire great people, and so forth. And it's actually something I used to disagree with Jack about at Square. And it's not that he's anti-people, but his whole thing is get the work, like figure out the work and then, put the people around it. And I definitely think the different way. And it may be why we were a good yin and yang together, by the way, too. But that people first mentality was very much, that is driven from my parents. Now, they wouldn't have put it in a hardcore Silicon Valley growth company context, but they would have always said, the people are the thing that you spend your time on, and they're the hardest thing. I do love what you said about, like, I think one of the best pieces of advice I got early in my career was actually the one you said, which was not to try to make my weaknesses better, but to make my spike, is what McKinsey calls it, the best spike of all, so that I was the expert, like world expert was often the phrase they'd use in that thing. And then the second reason why I think I gravitated so fast to numbers, I mean, I do love a number, but it also can take out a lot of the bias. So when I joined Goldman, at the time, a really famous woman on Wall Street was Abby Joseph Cohen. She was kind of known for calling the bull market. And Abby kind of took me aside at one stage and said, get yourself into a slot with the firm where your work is very quant and how it is scored and reviewed is completely quant. And research actually was the perfect fit for that, because in the end, like if you don't get your stock calls right, it doesn't matter who you know, who you go drinking with, like who you play golf with, does not matter. Like you are there to make a return on an equity. And if you don't, nothing else gets in the way.
Love that. Staying on your theme of people, I've said a lot of times, I've hired a couple hundred people. I'm sure you've hired a couple thousand at this point. And, I'm definitely not smart enough to sit across somebody in on a conference table in one or two interviews and know whether that person's going to be a great fit for our company. I actually feel that that's a pretty artificial way to know whether you want to spend the next 3+ years of your life working 10 hours a day with somebody. I often think that, hey, I either need to rely on a warm recommendation, or we just need to start working together for a period of time and get to know each other wherever that's an option. What are the most important characteristics you look for in talent, and how over the years have you sharpened your saw about how to know when someone is really going to be extraordinary and a great fit for your organization?
Yeah, so I'd actually start first of all by saying don't overthink it in your head, because when you are growing a fast growth organization, you are not going to bat 100 or whatever the right phrase is. Like, you're not going to get it right. And even if you get it right, it is unlikely that someone you hire today, if your company's really in that S curve of growth, there's very few people grow at the pace of the company. And so they may be perfect right now, and in 2 years they won't be. So I think you need to go in a little bit with less of a perfectionist mindset. If I could in recruiting, but I don't think this is doable, my preference would be actually to only interview a person for half an hour and then spend 10 hours reference checking them, because I actually think that's where the real money comes. And of course, not just the references they give you, but that's where you go use your network and really find out how they performed. Because again, I agree with you. I don't think an interview is a perfect situation to know. I mean, that said, I have a couple of key interview questions. I always start with I call it I can't believe I'm using so many sports analogies. My husband is laughing somewhere, but the ball that's coming straight down the middle of the plate to me is, we're going to have a short interview. It'll feel like a speed date. What should I absolutely leave knowing about you? And so it's kind of the elevator pitch of yourself. And I'm actually testing, not even for what you say, but can you say it in a way that is pithy, summarized, and I will remember it. And it's amazing how few people can even just do something that basic in an interview. And then the second thing I then say is, tell me also why you're perfect for Nextdoor, because it's also a way to test what homework have they done on the company, like how interested are they really. I do think it's important when you're interviewing to test your core values. Like, as you build a company, super important that you are clear on what your culture is. So in terms of core values at Nextdoor, our top two are earn trust every day and invest in community. Invest in community is like the easiest core value in the world to ask about, because you just say, tell me how you've invested in community. And there have been times, actually one of my very good hires in the last couple of years was our head of Canada. Hopefully he's listening. And we were looking at two super strong candidates. And actually the team was tilting a little towards the other candidate, although they love the candidate that we have. We love you very much. When I asked the other candidate it was a man in this case, he invested in community, his response was, I actually haven't had time yet in my life, but I just had a son and now I'm ready and I understand the importance. And that may be true, but honestly, it goes back to your nature versus nurture. If it's just not in you, it doesn't mean that you are a bad person or that you're a bad employee. It just means you are not the right fit for our organization, because that is so at the core of who Nextdoor is and what we stand for. And so I think it's incredibly important when you are interviewing or adding to your organization that you get that cultural moment too. And then finally, I mean, we can't do it right now in COVID, but for very senior hires, breaking bread with people, to me, is like just the moment where you go up for a longer dinner and you really see, do you like this person? Mm-hmm. Can you imagine hanging out with them when times get really, really tough? And when I first met Jack at Square, we met at Blue Bottle Coffee on a Saturday or Sunday morning. I think it was a Sunday morning. It was like Mother's Day, actually. It was a badly chosen day. And we were there for an hour-long coffee breakfast, and we were still there probably 2.5, 3 hours later. And we still hadn't really gotten beyond more of our personal experience. And like that to me was the moment where I really felt super bought into like whatever this man is building or doing, I want to be part of it because he cares so much about me as a person that I'm going to run through walls for him. And so, I would, if you go out for dinner and you're kind of stuck for a conversation half an hour in, it's not like the total nail in the coffin, but you should think about it. Like, is this really the person that I'm going to want to do battle with every day?
Yeah. You reminded me of two things. One is, I think there's literally one question candidates can ask that will make them $1 million more over the course of their career. And it's simply in every single job interview asking, what are you most looking for in this role? Mm-hmm. Because I think a lot of times what people, where they hurt themselves in the interview process, they go on about a lot of things that isn't key to their hiring manager. And that hiring manager, if they have any sense about them, will give that person the perfect cliff notes of exactly what they're looking for. And then that person just needs to match. On the flip side, I think one of the things that I've started doing as a manager that gives me a lot more empathy to where my team is at is I actually have us do exercises of things that they may be good at that I'm not good at all. Mm-hmm. Because my natural human inclination is to think things like, well, this comes naturally to me. This comes naturally to me. Like, why isn't the team excelling in these areas? Mm-hmm. And then we'll just do some exercises. Many times it'll be like an off-site where it's some, brain teaser or something that I'm awful at, and I'll see my team excel at it. Yeah. And it's like a light bulb goes off that like, oh, I need to put this person in the right situation where their skills can stand out. And I think what you said that's so important is that just because someone's not the right fit for maybe a Nextdoor comparably doesn't mean that they're not going to have a big, amazing, incredible career at whatever that right fit is for them.
Yeah.
I know for a fact that there are a lot of people out there, whether they've worked with you closely or watched you from afar, that consider you their mentor. Mm-hmm. You talked about Jack. Who are the 2 or 3 folks? You talked about Jack. You talked about, your mentor and that woman in the finance world. Who are the 2 or 3 people that you feel like really were the most impressional upon you, and who you learned the most from it? And what were those key lessons that you've taken from them?
Yeah, so I'll actually first of all give you a classic, kind of McKinsey 2x2 or whatever on how I think about mentorship, because I think it changes so much over the course of your career. I think you should always have a mentor in the place you're working because they see you in the context and can give you much more real-time proximate feedback. I think you should also have a mentor from a prior life because in some ways, once you leave their organization, it's like they've taken truth serum and they tell you much tougher feedback that you wish they told you when you worked with them. But we're human in the end, and it's hard to give people super brutal feedback all the time and then expect to maintain a nice working relationship. I think you should also have someone very close to you personally, where you know that even the toughest feedback is coming wrapped in a big ball of love, and that they only want the best for you, but they will be really tough on you. My husband is in that camp for me. And then I think you should have a stretch mentor, aspirational person where they're super busy. They are not going to suddenly roll out the red carpet and be like, yeah, come over for an hour and just talk. But there's someone who can have really kind of snippet-like feedback for you, particularly if you're pointed with your questions. And don't do the mentor me. Like, I hate that. People show up in, whatever room and they sit down, they're like, mentor me. I'm like, no. I need like, what are you striving for? What are you working on? And how can I be most helpful? Because I'm busy. So let's cut to the chase. In terms of like people who have really impacted me, clearly I've talked about Jack. I think, on Mary Meeker, who actually now sits on my board, but if I kind of go back in time, Mary at the beginning of Square, I just thought was just such a great mentor for me personally, because, to this day, she's always available for those quick snippet conversations. She's really good at calling bullshit like on me or whatever it is that I'm thinking in that moment, but she's also very numerate. So like she will push me to say, why are you making that decision? What's the basis for it? So I really enjoy that back and forth. Like I've already had a back and forth with Mary this morning. So she's kind of still in my life, and I'm very grateful for that over an extended period of time. And now she's seen me in 2 different roles. I find her very useful in this kind of second role. And I think the other person that I would call out is David Vinier, who, Jack would give me the credit of hiring him onto the board of Square. David, he's the ex-CFO of Goldman Sachs. I was starting my career as a CFO, and David just had these just wonderful, he had this wonderful way of not stressing you out, but of like being very clear that here was like a particular regiment he wanted you to partake in. So for example, he wanted to make sure that we as CFO and head of the audit committee always spoke once a month. And I was like, I don't think I'm going to have something to talk to you about once a month. And he's like, that's the point, because then we'll just get used to talking to each other. And then when the big thing comes, it's just going to be part of our normal diet of conversation, instead of the worst thing that can happen often where you have those kind of power differentials is the person who now has the problem is like, oh my God, if I call them, they're really going to think it's a big deal. And so in the moment when you should most be reaching out to a mentor or an advisor or whomever, you don't make the call because it's almost like you think it's too big a deal at that point, which I think is why it's so important to have created these relationships ahead of time. Mm-hmm. David certainly through that first 7 years of building Square, was just always the rock that I would turn to, because he'd kind of seen it all as well, right? He'd lived the financial crisis. He'd shepherded Goldman at a time when the firm could have easily gone out of business. And so, I felt like everything I brought to him at Square, even when my hair was on fire and it felt like an existential threat, he was just very calm about, okay, articulate the problem, tell me the next steps, are you looking around the corner? He was really good at that sort of unpeeling of a problem.
Yeah. I love the quadrant. I have a couple of quadrants of my own, and I absolutely love the advice of get a mentor from a previous company, because they'll just be that much more straightforward and honest with you. I think that's incredible. All right, so now, Sarah is Sarah's own mentor. So we're going to do the time machine question. This series is the If I Knew Then. So if you could take the time machine and go back into your 20s and have a drink with yourself at a pub, what personal or professional advice are you giving yourself then, and why? And then we'll do the same thing maybe 5 or 10 years later in your 30s. But if you take the time machine back to your 20s, what are you telling that Sarah?
So first, if we're in the pub having a drink, I would say add tonic water to that gin, because gin on ice, it was my way of saving money. In my 20s, I think a couple of things. One was that I didn't have to be perfect. I think in particular for women or for young girls, and now I have a 15-year-old, I'm very cognizant of this. There is a perfectionism that comes to life because of a feeling of you have to be better than everyone else. And it doesn't happen to boys. And it's that perfectionism that actually holds you back from being a risk taker. So, I would have died in my, 18 through mid 20s self, particularly when I was in college, if I wasn't getting straight A's in everything. And I think it would have been good for me sometimes to have gone and taken a course where I probably was going to get a C or something, because it would have been good for me to have both experienced what it's like to have to be resilient in times of failure, but also I probably would have learned more, frankly. So number one is definitely the perfectionist problem. And I think number 2 would have been not feeling like I had to fulfill the mold of like what the people around me wanted me to do. Now I already kind of talked about how I definitely was a little bit of a rule breaker. Like my parents would not have said I was being held back by their mold. The Northern Irish mold would have been, that I go become a doctor or a lawyer or something very vocational. But I still felt that weight to work in a professional environment. And, I don't know if I could have done a startup in my 20s, because it would have felt so far from the beaten track of like, what if I, can't make any money? And what if I go bankrupt, right? These fears that are actually also very UK. I think if I'd grown up in Silicon Valley, I would have felt very different about that. But the UK, the idea of going bankrupt is something that you would never want to have happened or to fail. And in Silicon Valley, right, we laud the failure, right? It's your time of greatest learning.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to even get more of your perspective there. I mean, one of the things that I'm sure you were constantly in environments and in an engineering role at Oxford, in finance, when you were there. I mean, I'm sure a lot of times you were amongst a smaller group of women with a group of a lot of men. I've even seen it with, my own wife and her career, how she always held herself to this unbelievably high standard that I never held myself to and never felt like I had to. Um, like, how does that change? And is that, again, something that's kind of innate to folks, or is that perpetuated in society? Like, where is that coming from, and how does that become more of an equal playing field?
Yeah, I don't know if it ever goes away. It's maybe a good starting point. So I have to remind myself constantly that, I don't have to be perfect. And in fact, gosh, and I've now quoted Jack about 3 times, but one of the things he advised me when I moved to Nextdoor was to be unafraid of failing publicly. In fact, he said it will be good because you're actually setting an example for others. So don't even think of it doing it for yourself, but do it for others. But it's still a very, it's a held thing that's harder for me. I think societally, it's definitely heaped on the shoulders of girls and then women so much more. Like every bit of research you ever look at, right? Women have to, when they walk in, I mean, that when they go into job interviews, right? Women will look at the job spec, and if they don't fulfill every single bullet on the spec, they won't even apply, right? Men take a look at it and they're like, I could do 20% of this job. Of course they'll hire me, right? I mean, I'm being very stereotypical to make my point. I think during performance reviews, like my own personal experience of giving a lot of performance reviews over the course of my career so far, is that when I start a performance review with a woman, they always want to skip over the good stuff. Like, yeah. Let's get to what I can work on.
Mm-hmm.
And then I often ask people at the end of a performance review, tell me what you heard. Like, what were the top 3 things we talked about? And the women will always regurgitate the 3 things that they're going to go away and work on. And I ask that question so that I can actually say, no, that's actually not that's what you think you heard. But what you heard was you are great at this and you're great at that. And yes, you're going to work on this 3rd thing. I find with men, when I ask that question, it's like all of the constructive feedback I gave them, they were just singing a tune to themselves while I was giving it, because they heard the really good stuff, like the place they'd made a big impact. And so we have to just train like our minds and ourselves to kind of recognize that these biases exist. And then, how do we kind of tilt people back? Because like on both sides, right? I think a lot of men I work with are missing out if they're not hearing the constructive feedback that's going to help them soar. And equally the women, if they're not hearing the things that they're really good at and not kind of having that moment where you exhale, right? It just becomes too much. Like you've got to be very careful of just your psychological well-being alongside your work, because I think the biggest reason people leave jobs, people always say it's because of your manager, but I think it's just your morale gets so broken down if you're not being protective of that. So yeah, can we change it? For sure. We can create role models. We can kind of show, not tell. We can norm people to kind of what to expect from women leaders, and show that they make mistakes, but they do great things, and that they're no different from their male counterparts. They don't have to be some paragons of, leadership or whatever.
Yeah. Going back to your earlier point about the importance of numbers and data, when we started Comparably, one of the things we wanted to do is build an employee review platform that specifically gave every company a gender score, gave every company a diversity score. So that means we know how companies and leadership teams are specifically rated by women, by employees who are Black and Latino and Asian. And one of the surprising things to me, probably not to a lot of women, is that female CEOs are consistently rated lower by their female employees than their male employees. Mm-hmm. And I think my takeaway there is that women have higher standards for other women in leadership. Like they're expecting so much of them, and so it comes from all different angles. Before we kind of go to your advice in the 30s, I think now is probably a great time for you to talk a little bit about Ladies Who Launch. why you started this, what you're doing there. I think it's really incredible.
Thank you. Yeah, so Ladies Who Launch began as a passion project. So when I was at Square, along with another great Square, Kelly McGonigal, we co-founded Ladies Who Launch, and it was really an event. We didn't co-found anything. We did an event for a bunch of women to celebrate International Women's Day, and we had such like a resonance from it that everyone wanted us to do a next one and then a next one. And so we ended up doing a series of these events. Now over the course of about 6 years, we've done them all over the world. We've been to Sydney in Australia. We go back to Belfast in Northern Ireland, and we've done it now 4 years in a row. So it's very personal for me. We've gone to London and then across the US. It's a lot of tier 2 cities I find do a lot better. So cities like St. Louis or Denver. We were actually going to have our big summit this year in Oakland. What we realized is there was so much demand. So Ladies Who Launch is premised on 3 things: building community, so has a strong pillar of peer mentorship. So one of the things women often don't get is an ability to find like-minded women who can just be at the end of a call or a text for a quick question on a business issue. Education. So again, a lot of women feel like there's not a singular place to go to as you're building your business to find, just resources, like how do you raise capital, for example. And then the third piece was inspiration. And that goes back to that role model piece about how do we just get great women who have been there, done that. And frankly, what I find is when we're interviewing those women, you start with all the good, but the moment where it becomes really authentic and the whole audience is leaning in is usually when that woman is talking about what went wrong, like the moment where the failure came or had to try over and over again. Because I think in that moment, that vulnerability is where everyone kind of understands that even the people they see at the top of the mountain, it wasn't just like a straight climb up there. This year, good note to anyone building any business, remember to figure out if you're the bottleneck. So kind of recognized that I was definitely the bottleneck because I just didn't have the time. And so we hired our executive director, and what an unlock that has been. At a crazy moment when COVID should have been the worst thing for our business because we're an in-person event series, we were able to pivot to a lot of online webinars, a lot of podcasts, and we got to like what has really been the dream come true, which is our launch program, which is a grant program. We're bringing together, we haven't announced our finalists, but we had 2,000 applications. We winnowed it down to 10, and I will tell you that was heartbreaking because there are another 1,990 businesses that really deserve your money, but to 10, we're going to create a cohort so that they get bonded together. And then we will do kind of an education series for the next 6 months of teaching them different skills and so on in their business. And then they get a grant as well to help them. Like originally I thought it would be to help them kind of survive the current crisis, but for many of these businesses, they're great businesses. So actually I think the money will help them accelerate. And the pivots that many of them are doing are fantastic.
Yeah. One of the things that I'd love to get your perspective on. So you're on the board of Walmart, you're on the board of Slack, you're doing all this work with Ladies Who Launch. Like, let's get down to brass tacks. If what do more companies and more investors need to do day by day, week by week, month by month to ensure that there's more diversity in their organizations, that there's more inclusion and investment dollars? Obviously, we want things to be merit-based, and that in no way excludes the fact that we're nowhere close as a society to the amount of equity that we should have in those areas. So, what's the advice you're giving the companies you're on the board? What's the advice that you're giving the advisors that you're talking to? And what are the actionable steps that we can take? And you also shared this really amazing example before we started of this product you're working with DocSend that even showed investors are, measurably and statistically having bias in how they review, pitch decks from different folks.
Yeah. So a couple of things in there. Number one is diversity should be a business imperative. It's crazy how many studies have been done on how, for example, in the boardroom, boards that are more diverse, the stocks of those companies inherently do better. And when executive teams are more diverse, companies create more cash flow, more return on investment. So the idea that you're doing it for good, I mean, as you can tell, I'm all about like good in the world, but it's cold, hard business to have diversity at your board level, at your senior executive level, at your next layer down. Just if you want to look like your customer to be able to give them the best possible products, you need to look like your customer, really look like it. So, for example, within Nextdoor, when I joined, I was definitely very focused on the gender piece. I felt strongly that Silicon Valley companies weren't great at having women on boards, and I wanted to fix that. So I was super proud, pat myself on the back here, that with our board, our board of directors and board observers kind of together, we were 50-50. And then I recognized, as particularly as the George Floyd murder kind of put the spotlight on Black Lives Matter and everything going on societally, I'm like, I have failed on the people of color front because I hadn't made it my own personal like business imperative. And so what I promised my company is like, I failed, but I am going to go fix it. So number one was set a target. So I said in Q3, my objective is a more diverse board because I think it's better for the company. And my KR will be hiring someone. And I think the way you keep yourself honest is you keep giving regular updates. And if you're getting behind, you feel the pressure of that. Like if you don't put people first, actually one tick I have is I do try to do all people stuff first thing in the morning because I'm a morning person. Since I believe it's my most important thing to do, I do it when my brain is freshest. And what I see with a lot of managers who are getting snowed is they do their to-do list and then they move to like their hiring at the end of the day when they're just exhausted. And then they wonder why they get to the end of a quarter or a period and they've still not made the hire. So you got to totally let things lie on the floor to get your most important thing done. So in my case, it was not, to get a diverse board member. I went out into my network, and it is a good reminder that if you're starting from scratch, it's going to take a long time. And thankfully, I realized actually I have a good network here. I don't buy the pipeline problem at all. I interviewed so many great candidates that frankly, the problem I had was turning people down. I got it down to a final 3. I couldn't make a decision. So yesterday, we actually announced 2 new board members to bring more of that diversity of perspective. And just frankly, they're great business people. So John Hope Bryant from Operation Hope, he's also the CEO and chairman of Promise Homes, and Andrea Wisham, who used to worked with Oprah for about 20 years, and now is the COO at Skywalker Properties. They're both amazing individuals, but it was, I made the decision, I flagged my weakness, I created a metric, and then I just wouldn't let myself stop until I pushed it over the line for Q3. And so that's what I tell all, like whether it's Stuart at Slack, Doug at Walmart, like if we want to make a change, particularly from a people and diversity perspective, it has to be with real goals, real accountability, and we need to talk about it at the board level. Otherwise, we're just sending a strong signal that actually we don't care if we don't do that.
Yeah. Well, you just taught me something again, which is one of the reasons I selfishly love doing these interviews, because I feel like it's my own CEO coaching. But I'm definitely guilty of setting too many of my one-on-ones with the team in the afternoon, and I'll give myself my individual contributor tasks that I need to do in the beginning part of the day. And what happens is sometimes those meetings get pushed back. They don't have the most fresh version of myself, and that's a mistake I'm making. I'm really curious to know how you run your one-on-one meetings with your direct reports, and then how you run an executive team meeting. So if we're reporting to you, Sarah, what should we expect in that one-on-one? How are you running that meeting? And if we all get to be a fly on the wall in your exec team meeting, what are the tips and tricks that you've got?
Yeah. So if there's anyone listening who's worked with me, they're now laughing because they're like, oh, what a softball, because I am quite regimented about one-on-ones. So for a start, I have a one-on-one document. It has 3 P's in it. So performance, people, and then product. The performance is I'm asking you to actually not just tell me how, with your blinkers on, your little silo is going. I actually want you to look around the whole company and just tell me, since we last met, and I usually do one-on-ones every 2 weeks, what have you noticed in terms of performance of the company? And it could be anything from our hiring momentum, what's going on with our engagement metric, it might be in your bailiwick and you're like very much like, okay, you have to know this, but performance, people is of course, about your team that I might not get to do one-on-ones with. So how is your direct team functioning? If you're an individual contributor and you report to me, that's your moment where, you can be much more personal about what's working. And every kind of call it 6 weeks to 2 months, I try to do like a feedback section. I actually don't love performance reviews. I probably shouldn't say that out loud because I don't love this idea that, this huge period of time goes by and then suddenly, the same tablets drop from above and you get some performance feedback. Like performance feedback should be very proximate, ideally in the moment. Product is what you're working on. And honestly, if we don't get to it, it doesn't matter so much because the way we run the company, I should have a pretty good handle on what's going on with the product. And I use the word product in all contexts. Like even as a CFO, I would call the 10K a product, or the tax report that we had to do was a product. Because I think when you think in a product mindset, then you think about what does my customer need? What are the insights I'm getting? Have I alphaed it, beta tested it? When are we going to launch it, right? You speak in that language everywhere in the company. So the 3 Ps, and my ask is always that you take a crack at that document the night before our one-on-one and just hit send. And I'm a super early morning person, so I will look at it in the early morning. And I do that, frankly, it's twofold. One is I want you in the headspace where you're ready to come have a one-on-one, because I think so many people get in a one-on-one and they just start like shooting the breeze and they remember this and then they walk out. And the minute they walk out, they're like, oh, the thing I meant to tell you was, and it's almost like I've seen this happen over and over again. You don't get to like the main thing that you wanted to talk about. The second reason I do it is to be efficient, because if you're asking things of me, I can hopefully maybe answer things or find that piece of analysis or whatever before you walk into the one-on-one, so we don't have to meet twice. So I'm just trying to kind of shorten the amount of times we need to talk about something. So that's a one-on-one with Sarah. On my team meetings, it's less regimented. In a typical team meetings, we do something across the company where we do stand-ups on Mondays. The main kind of product areas, we call them pillars, meet for an hour and they create kind of 4 bullets of what happened in the last week or what's coming. So in those 4 bullets, we pull that together across the 6 pillars, whatever, so 24 bullets. And so I start all my management meetings with the whole executive team just reading that document. So actually, one thing I am a fan of is the silent read before we talk. And I find that really good for diversity, because not everyone is extroverted. And so it allows your quieter types who maybe in the moment, like I find often when you work in very technical environments, again, massive stereotype about to be spoken by Sarah, but more technical types get bulldozed by the business folks who are really good at the pitch, and the PowerPoint slides. We don't have any of that, or the, whatever Google slides you use now. We write everything down. So we use prose format, and then we silently read. And then the second half of the meeting, we talk. So that's kind of usually the start of our executive meeting. And then, either we schedule in if there's particular things that are very top of mind, because I don't want the team to have to through the week go find calendar slots. So we use the second part of the meeting for that. And then there's just good and welfare. And I try to make my team a little uncomfortable once in a while. Sometimes I'll start a meeting just doing gratitude. What are you grateful for? Because I think it is a moment of being a human being. When we are doing intense meetings like offsites, I actually will start with a 10-minute meditation, which is kind of weird in a COVID where you're all in a box and suddenly it goes quiet and I'm playing my little meditation app to you. But I think it's a really good brain moment to allow people to get into very tough conversations where there's probably going to be a lot of really tough debate, but to kind of be able to stay in that zone for longer. So that might be very Silicon Valley. I did not learn that in Northern Ireland, but I do love it as a technique to kind of bring your team together.
Yeah, I love the gratitude exercise. There's a lot that I've learned from YPO, Young Presidents Organization, of just how to structure meetings and really what to do in the first minute just to get it off the right way. I think that's a great example. You also brought up something that struck a chord with me that I've always found it so artificial that oh, someone's going to get performance feedback once a quarter or twice a year, or sometimes once a year. I mean, one of the things I try to do with direct reports is we're going to meet weekly, and there's going to be three things we go over. I'm going to give you feedback on what you're doing great and a couple areas that you can even improve. I'm going to ask you for where you need help and resources. And then I'm going to ask you where I can improve and where the company can improve. And I think one of the things that's important is that managers get in a regular habit of asking their team, what do you need help with and where do we need to be better?
Yeah.
And just again, on a practical level, it staves off so many issues, that would otherwise come up. I don't want to forget the second time machine. So I want to take a time machine now, maybe 10 years later and, here into your 30s. And what's the professional or personal advice you're giving yourself and why?
Yeah. So in my 30s, I was definitely in that zone where I just had my kids. And so I think the two things that really strike me about that time in my professional life, one was actually a lot of fearfulness to leave the thing I had become good at. So by your 30s, you've definitely developed expertise, and it's very easy to just keep staying because you're frankly good at it. And I'll give you another kind of quadrant is, passion and expertise. And so places where you have high passion, high expertise, that is your zone. Go run towards those things all the time. But things where you have high expertise and low passion, they are very draining, but so easy to get caught up in for other reasons. Like I make a lot of money, or I know what I'm doing. I can balance all the things in my life. And so if I think about my career on Wall Street, I probably outstayed its welcome for about 5 years. I was really good at it. I was really good at it. I made great money. I could kind of figure it out. Like I worked that crazy early morning schedule of like someone working market hours, but that meant I got home every day at like 3:30, 4 o'clock. And I had very young kids, right? I think they go to sleep at like 6:37. So there's a small window when they're actually alive to spend time with them. And so I just kept staying, and, I don't know if my life would have been different, but I wish I had had the confidence to jump sooner. That's probably number one. And number two was, I did also feel this, again, intense pressure to move to the next thing. Like somehow I would be unemployable. Like once I finally made that move off Wall Street, giving myself more of a break. I didn't. So I guess if I could go back, I would probably tell myself, take some break, because this career is going to be long, and having an extra 6-9 months to, honestly not do very much, maybe just hang out with your kids, might not be a bad thing, because that time will go by so fast. It's super trite, but I think it's very true. I just heard Jane, the new CEO of Citi, talk. And that was actually one of the things that she talked about, was it being okay to sometimes just jump off the big treadmill for a while. I've been terrible at this in my career, but that's why I would love to, if I got to go back, maybe give it a go a little and see if there's, some moments where you pull back in order to rest, recover, and then lean back in again.
Yeah, that they both really strike a chord with me. I've talked a lot about how, I went to business school and law school. If I had to do it over again, I wouldn't have done that. And I would have just jumped into trying to start a company earlier and not told myself, oh, I'm not ready for it yet. On the other hand, after I sold my last company to Intuit, I would have taken more time. I basically started, comparably 6 months after, and I felt this intense pressure. I had to get back in the game. And, the moment was going to pass me by, and investors wouldn't want to back me, if it wasn't happening right away. And I think having more time to take for my family at that point and just look at the whole board of opportunities would have been good. One other question I want to ask related to the time machine, and I'm actually going to share an example of it. So I want to know from you something that you feel like you weren't good at, or you made a mistake that you've gotten better at in hindsight. And I'll tell you mine, which is a big mistake I made early on as an entrepreneur is I saved the best part of myself for things external to the company. It was our investors and our customers and press that always got the best version of Jason, the most charismatic, the highest energy, the most giving of time. And I think what happened is when I was inside the office, we were working 12 hours a day, literally for years, every single day, which you've lived and then some.
Yeah.
You know, the team often saw the version of me that was, while respectful, more short and more stressed out and more felt like, hey, we have to deliver on these promises to everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And looking back, right, that was just a huge mistake. The people that needed the best version of myself, the team who was doing all the work that endured all these benefits to our customers and investors, they needed the best version of me, and they didn't get it for many years. And so one of the commitments that I made starting this company, you know, the nice thing about going to a new organization is you get to say, oh, here's all the things I'm going to get a fresh slate on, and I get to be the new version of me.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I tried to do, and I still fall down a lot, but I try on a daily and weekly basis to make sure that the best part of myself I'm giving to the team,
Mm-hmm.
and that they need to get that first, and then it will endure to everybody else, whether it's our customers or our investors or any other stakeholder. So that was my big mistake. You know, in your case, what would you say you wish you had an opportunity to do differently, or what you've gotten better at over time?
Yeah, it's a great question, and that's actually a great learning. I love doing these things too because I learned so much. There's probably two things jumping to mind. One, because it's a little fresh in my head, I just was speaking to a dear friend, but a colleague from Square at the weekend, just for catching up super fast. And he made like a passing comment about succession planning, and really, and it's kind of stuck with me because, you know, like I'm going nowhere, like I'm in this and I love it, love it, love it. I do feel like sometimes I'm someone that takes you all the way to the edge, and then suddenly that's when I'm not doing. Like I think if you asked anyone the day before I left the thing that they worked with me on, what they have said, is this the moment where Sarah is about to change what she's doing? They would have been like, oh no, she's like so fired up. And I do, you know, my husband often says I only have like two gears, to like an on and an off switch. So I probably find it hard to be gradated on that because I am all in. Like when I'm all in, I'm all in. And so I think something I'm thinking more about, I wouldn't say a lot about, but more about, because I'm still so young with Nextdoor, but how do I gracefully at some point think about that transition moment? You know, and I think there's other, like someone who's been a good mentor through my career is Anil Bushray at Workday. And he's a great example of someone who just brought on a co-CEO, for example. And so it's kind of an interesting way to think about the longer arc of your career. And like as someone starting a company, I'm sure that kind of sits with you as well, because you can become almost the personification of the company in a way that is both energizing and awesome for people, but also you have to be careful of the risk that you're building in. So that's probably like one. And then the second thing is being mindful of my own energy. Like I really believe that one of my core jobs as CEO is to be the pace setter at the company. And, you know, I used to always jokingly say, I will never ask you to do anything I wouldn't do myself. But unfortunately, I have a really high pain threshold. So welcome. So that is both a good thing, but also because I'm naturally very curious, I can like, you know, people who work with me can like almost feel like it's spinning faster and faster and faster. And so being careful not to wear people out and allowing people to just say, no, we're not going to do that. No, we have our 3 focus areas for the quarter. We love your 20 new ideas, but we are going to focus on these 3 things. And even though I tell people the best thing you can do in my moments where I'm really excited about some new thing is to remind me that we have a focus and that you're saying no. And I respect the life out of that. Actually, I often give examples all the time of like great moments where people said no to me, and you know, the team that I've worked with most consistently, like the people that have come with me from prior lives to right now work with me at Nextdoor, I think their superpower is just knowing when to like turn Sarah off. Like the RBG moment, like the best marriage is when you get a little bit selectively deaf. Like it could turn out that in the work environment, the best work marriage is when you become selectively deaf too. But there's something in that I'm struggling through or thinking a lot about at the moment, because I think in COVID, right, people are very stretched on so many new dimensions that none of us have worked with before, right? If you're a parent with younger kids at home, right? You know, I have teenagers at home, and that's bad enough. So trying to be empathetic on that front is a good example of me not overstretching people.
Yeah. Well, there are, I've had the good fortune of probably doing 100 of these different CEO interviews. And I got to tell you that this was probably in the top 5 where I feel like I got to learn the most.
Oh,
And, I like, for anyone that has a chance to use the product and is working with you, I mean, it's clear to see that what comes across is the sense of community, kindness, inclusion, combined with, hey, we are going to have incredibly high standards and we're going to be a performance-based organization. And I think that's an incredible takeaway. I'm also curious to see what it's like to be one of your kids getting help with their homework or sports. And I'm sure you've got a quadrant for every one of them. I imagine on your daughter's wall, like there's a quadrant of scholastic excellence and sports performance and
oh,
extracurricular activities. So maybe we'll be able to include that in the follow-up write-up as well. But Sarah, this has just been an absolute treat for me, and I know it's going to be for so many people. It's rare to meet somebody that is both so accomplished and giving and thoughtful and humble and charismatic. And I think the world's a lot better place for having someone like you doing what you're doing, connecting so many of us. And I'm so excited to keep seeing where Nextdoor iterates and the big, huge things that lie ahead for you all.
thank you. You're being super generous, but I really enjoyed the conversation. And it was, I feel like I learned a lot as I went too. So much appreciate. Stay well, be a good neighbor.
Well, thank you everybody for joining. Connect with me on Nextdoor if you're here in Los Angeles. Definitely sign up for the app if somehow you haven't found your way to it already. And thank you for continuing to join us. We're going to continue to have an amazing lineup of guests here on Entrepreneur like Sarah. And stay safe, stay sane, be well, and all the best during these uncertain and weird times. And thank you again, Sarah.
Thank you. Bye.